Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 95th episode of the Truth Island podcast. Of human virtues, patience is most great, is often attributed to the Roman writer Cato the Elder. In today's society, we are filled with a lot of mixed messages. On one hand, we are told that patience and delayed gratification remain the keys to living a successful life. We are told to get an education, not to rush into marriage, wait until we have kids, and that a worthwhile career can take decades to fully formalize. On the other hand, our money making instant result culture also fills us with cliches such as strike when the iron is hot, or in just about every action movie, you've probably heard the line, "Well, what are you waiting for?" as a means of as a means of prompting the protagonist into action. In many ways, our culture is extremely paradoxical, where we tell people to be patient and wait in line for their time in the spotlight in one breath, but then in the very next second, we criticize someone who isn't aggressive enough as being a slacker or not a real go-getter. Indeed, patience, much like anything, has its time and place. But at other moments, it's the early bird who catches the worm. Joining me to figure out when exactly we are standing at either a green or red light, I am once again joined by Sam. Sam, when you're going through a yellow light, do you start slowing down or do you just like rush on through?
Man, great question. Are there any police officers listening to this podcast? It depends. I think my time in Latin America probably would make me more inclined to slow down. I'm in Colombia right now in South America, and one of people's favorite things to say to me as an obvious gringo is the Spanish word tranquilo, or which basically just means chill out, relax. Because I'll apologize for not speaking English or Spanish, sorry, or apologize for not knowing something about the culture or whatever, and or just be moving too quickly in general or talking too fast, trying to get my point across. And so I've heard that just countless times. And I think I've noticed even just a general kind of mellowing where it's like I do need to, exercise caution and slow down instead of speed up through an intersection. But you're right. I think this is the tension of our culture, and it's the tension of my personality. I grew up in a home. One of the favorite Bible verses was from the book of Ephesians in the New Testament, chapter 5, where it's like, redeem the time. My grandma said that all the time. My dad said that all the time. It was like, make things happen now. Don't waste any time. There shouldn't be any idle time. There's no sense of process or deliberation. Make decisions now. Seize the day, seize the moment. And be a person of action, and so patience was not a virtue growing up. It's process, the idea of like process and being in process personally wasn't a virtue. It wasn't something we talked about or understood. So I've really had to learn some of these virtues in my adulthood.
I think you're tapping into some wonderful stuff that we can talk into. Living in New York right now, they have really gone crazy with the cameras here. So if you are caught with a red light, like there's so many cameras that are flicking off and you're going to get like that $50 ticket. So I'm definitely slowing down at my yellow lights and making sure that I'm not going through there. And I think it's a good analogy. I think, yellow and red lights is a good analogy for this entire freaking year. Okay. I think this is one of the slowest years that we've had in recent memory. And I've noticed that other years have gone by so quickly, so darn quickly. Were we moving through? We were rushing from place to place, appointment to appointment, bar to bar, restaurant to restaurant, show to show. And that's just like the New York, especially in the New York region, that's life. It's really hyper fast, hyper quick. Our subways don't move the quickest, but they can get you around pretty quickly, compared to other systems. And this year has really been a screeching halt, right? It's been a year of, I call it the year of the philosopher, because it's been a year of deep contemplation. And I think that there are times in our life where we need to be contemplative, and I think that that's very important. And I think that if we think about different times in our life, maybe your grandma's right, that maybe there is time where it's like, hey man, put down that video game controller, now's the time for action, right? And I think there are clear moments where your grandma is 110% right, where we need to strike. But then there are other times where I think the universe is saying, whoa, slow down there, slow down. And I think we could talk a little bit about when are moments that we should strike when the iron's hot, and when are moments that we kind of need to collectively slow down.
I love that line that this is the year of the philosopher. And by the way, I'm going to use that. I think that's perfect. And I think that's well said. I think a lot of people have had to confront with their dark side this year, the dark side of their relationships with their family or their spouse or themselves or their job. And that's very philosophical. That's theological too. It's anthropological. So it is the year of the philosopher. We've sort of been forced into a place of contemplation. And yeah, I think that this conversation goes back to some of our earlier podcasts, even a couple months ago when we first started this process, when you asked me about contentment and how unnaturally I sort of come to the topic of contentment. It's not something that I like talking about, and it taps into a deep FOMO, which I think is generational for people our age, a deep fear of missing out on what everybody else is doing. Instagram, I think, personally feeds that flame for me. I see the amazing things that people are doing and the amazing girlfriends and boyfriends that people have and food that they're eating and, whatever. And it's like, it just prompts this feeling of I've got to do more. So to me, patience and contentment are sort of twin virtues. If they're not siblings, they're cousins, and they're connected. I still don't have the secret, but I'm probably more aware every day, every week, every month, every year, how foreign those concepts are to me in a genuine way,
Mm-hmm.
and how much how much I still want to cultivate them.
What you're saying gets me thinking, and I'm going to kind of speak about my own experience prior to COVID and now living, in the COVID era. I think prior to COVID, I did a lot of stuff, Sam, not necessarily bad stuff, but I went out a lot and I did a lot of things without actually asking myself the fundamental question, why am I doing this? Like, why am I meeting these friends right now? Why am I going here? And I'll give you a very basic routine that this was something I used to do before COVID. My girlfriend and I would actually hop in the car, and we would drive all the way to a sports club that was located all the way in like Whitestone, and then we would go to one of these fancy grocery stores. We go to like I think it was like a Stop and Shop, and it was huge. Like they had all of this like tomato, all of this stuff, right? And what happened is that this was a part of our routine, right? It was just like, hey, this is how we spend our Sunday, and we thought we were being productive. We thought, hey, look how much out and about stuff we're doing. We're going here, we're going to a cool little cute diner, and then we're going to this fancy grocery store, and we spent like a ton of money on like a lot of groceries, and we deluded ourselves and said, man, oh man, like they have all the right stuff at this grocery, right? And what happened? COVID put an end to that entire lifestyle. It just put an end to this whole going and spending a lot of time out. And basically our lives changed, where all we do is go to Key Food right now that's like 2 blocks away from where we live. And guess what, Sam? everything that you need is right there. Everything that I could possibly want is freaking at that Key Food. I don't need to go drive anywhere to some fancy grocery store to get like a special organic tomato. And that's the virtue of patience, and that's the virtue of kind of slowing down, because I think in all of our lives we were running around and doing a lot of stuff, and the reason we were doing it is because we were impulsive and we were impatient. We didn't want to miss out. We wanted Instagram moments, we wanted Facebook memories, we wanted all of these things. So we were like scattered chickens with no heads running around creating what we considered to be iconic memories, when in actuality, all that we needed was right there within like a 2-block radius from, you know, at least in my case, everything I need is like 2 or 3 blocks away from my house. There's nothing that I need beyond that. And it's given me an appreciation for what was always in front of me. I think that, you know, this past year I've learned to appreciate my girlfriend so much more than I did before. I think I was less appreciative of my girlfriend prior to COVID because she was right there in front of my face, but maybe it didn't, the running around did not force me to interact with that as much.
It's funny you bring up Key Foods or Key Food because I had a similar experience when I lived in New York for 3 months this past fall. I was living in East Village, and there are not one but 2 Trader Joe's within a walking distance of East Village, which is crazy to me because I've lived most of my life in the hinterlands of America, the interior, where Trader Joe's and things like that really spell like civilization and like the millennial dream, you know, like those things were far away. Like most of my life, I've lived in rural Iowa and rural Illinois. I was in rural Illinois and rural Missouri and rural Georgia. And it's like all these rural small town places, and even towns the size of Chattanooga, you know, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa, like don't have Trader Joe's. And so I was like, okay, I'm in East Village and I've got 2 Trader Joe's. OMG, my mind was exploding, you know. But I kind of got into the routine, and then I was like, you know what? I had new goals. I was trying to live a little bit more cheaply, save a little bit of money, you know, just in case I wanted to go to South America for 6 weeks, you know, something like that. But I was like, my new goals were to live a little bit more in a more thrifty, resourceful way. And I went to Trader Joe's a couple of times. The lines were just out the door, and it's not expensive, but I was like, I don't really need to be here. And so I ended up just going to Key Food. And, you know, I'm sure there's somebody going to listen to this podcast and be like, wait a second, Key Food and Trader Joe's. I mean, which one's cheaper? They're probably, I don't know. But the point is, like, we don't need as much as we think sometimes. And I was really content just living kind of like a more basic, truly, genuinely basic life by going to the Key Food instead of one of the 2 Trader Joe's. And I think that's part of the reason, like, I'm doing what I'm doing. I've had so many people in Colombia ask me, like, where's your luggage, man? And they always ask me in Spanish, you know, where's your luggage? And I'm like, I actually don't have any luggage, which is hilarious to people. They're just like, what? And they're like, one guy who spoke pretty good English was like, you have to explain to me, like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on here? And I like gave him more context. I was like, well, actually, there's more context to this in my whole life. I'm actually kind of going through this period of downsizing and minimizing and all this stuff. And he's like, but why? Like, what are you hoping to discover from this experience? And I've actually come to describe it as an experiment, because you kind of have to figure out ways of explaining things in a few words, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like my way of trying to explain why I only have one outfit and no luggage is that I'm doing an experiment. And they're like, what are you learning? What are you hoping to learn from this experiment? And I think the answer is that I'm trying to learn how little I can actually get by on, you know? And I think that plays into what you're saying too.
And what's amazing about your experiment, Sam, is that it takes patience, because the lesson learned, the virtue that's gained from this experiment is not going to be apparent on day 2. It's only after a while you start learning, like, geez, I don't really need this. geez, I don't really need that, right? And all of this stuff requires investment. It requires you to stick on track. It requires you not to give up and not just be as whimsical, like not be so whimsical and just constantly changing your ideas of what you're doing every 5 seconds. There's a very good, I'm paraphrasing, but there's a very good idea that Warren Buffett has. And Warren Buffett describes himself as not being a day trader, meaning he's not just trying to trade stocks every single day and like short this and do, like what he says is that when I trade, I make sure that it's right. And I make sure I believe in the company, and I make sure that I believe in what I'm investing in. So I move extremely slowly. Like I'm a slow mover. If I do my due diligence, and I make sure that I am going to be with this company for the long game, not the short game, the long game. And I think that that's how you get to be successful, is by mapping things out for the long game. And that requires a great deal of patience. And I think that an episode I really liked that I did with my friend Alexander is, we said a lot of our society encourages us to make 5-year plans or 3-year plans or whatever it is. And I'm like, no, 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 you need to be making 80-year plans. You need to be actually making plans for the really, really long haul, and ask yourself, what the hell is it that I want to get out of this thing called life? And that requires a lot of patience. And even, like, I would argue, Sam, it is better to sit in your apartment and do nothing for 6 months, and then say to yourself, what is it that I really want to get out of this thing, and then proceed forward, than never taking that 6 months and just jumping to the next job, or the next thing that just basically falls in your lap. I think before COVID, everybody just did whatever it is that fell into their lap. They just, whatever fell into their lap, they just did. Okay, this is the next chapter in my life, as they would say. But I think this has actually taught us, you know what? If you can, hunker in your apartment for a while, think about things, let it sit. And only then, when you've decided what is the right course of action, then you may move forward.
Yeah, I was a pastor in Iowa for 3 years, as you know, Aaron, in small town Iowa, which is predominantly older people. And I remember on my 30th, a couple of weeks after my 30th birthday, I did a funeral for an 80-year-old man. And he had just turned 80 and I had just turned 30, and then he died. And I was thinking, wow, 50 years, like, that's not that much. I mean, if I add 20 to what I've already lived, and then add it to what I've already lived, I'm at 80, So it's like not that much. And as time goes on, time goes faster. I think my 3 years in Iowa, it's hard to know, all the reasons, if you will, God took me there. But to the wilderness of the prairie. But I'm glad I came into contact with older people. I got to the point where it was like, yeah, you can't even really begin to talk about age until you're 75. I mean, 75 to 95 was kind of like the wheelhouse for everybody. And then it was like, you can't really talk about real old age until you're 95. And that changes your perspective on mortality and the shortness of life and the brevity of things. And I was kind of glad for that. And it taught me about the long game in those terms, because I'm not good at creating the 5-year plan. I've never been super good. And maybe it's just, I haven't really forced myself to think in those terms. But sort of my time in Iowa helped me think more in those terms, at least in a longer range way. I was also really glad for the conversation you and I had the week of I got COVID. And then that following week, you and I talked. We didn't do a podcast because it was Thanksgiving, but we talked. And I was really glad for it, because you just reminded me, like, hey, try to not see your little room at this hostel as a literal physical waiting room, or as this period of time as a metaphorical waiting room. Try to be patient. Don't be afraid to wait. Don't be afraid of this process, but also be intentional. And I think maybe that's part of the answer to this question of, when is patience a virtue and when is being a mover and a shaker, a go-getter, a virtue? Or are they mutually exclusive? And I don't think so. And I think part of the answer to that riddle is intentionality, and to say, like, wherever I am. And we talked about this last week, and I actually want to hear more from you, Aaron, because you kind of coined this idea for me of the waiting room, the universe's waiting room.
Yeah.
The answer to the riddle is intentionality. Wherever you are, make the most of it, and not in a restless way. I mean, I think making the most of things from a place of to use my Spanish friends, tranquility, to do it from a place of tranquility and restfulness and free, and sort of a sense of freedom, that you're not forced or coerced to be or do certain things in certain situations, but just to use your own discernment and wisdom, to make the most of every situation. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I'm glad you're asking me these questions, and I'm happy to expand upon that. So that philosophy actually ties to Stoicism. And in Stoicism, there's two fundamental rules. And one of is that there are things in life that you can control, and there are things in your life that you cannot control. And every situation that you fall into in this world abides by that set of rules. You can control these variables, or you cannot control these variables. And maybe you have to think about it a little bit and be like, okay, that's kind of out of my, I can't control this COVID. I can't control, what's going on at work. I can't control how other people behave, right? Like that's also a very fundamental one that I've learned this year, is like, you cannot control how other people can behave. You can control how you react to that behavior. That is something that is always within your control. You can't, someone will yell at you. Do you yell up back at them, or do you smile and move on? That's entirely up to you. So I think that this ties into patience, in the sense that once you have figured out that you are in a situation that is beyond your control, right? You start mentally crossing those things off the list. Okay, I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't change this. You just mentally, you start, imagine there's like a huge chalkboard, and you just start bucketing all the things that are out of your control into one bucket. You're like, out of my control. Then you're left with the things that you can control. And using your example of being in that quarantine hostel for 10 days, do I have a laptop? Do I have the ability to make someone else laugh, right? And all of that requires a certain level of inner patience, because on one hand, you're like, man, I really want to be at a Broadway show right now, right? And you're dying for it. You're dying, and your impatience is starting to overtake you, right? Like your impulse to get exactly what it is that you want is starting to drive you nuts. But it's only going to drive you crazier, because the more you focus on what it is that you can't have or can't be doing, the crazier you become. So you need to develop patience and be like, all right, I have acceptance and patience that I can't have these things right now. It could even, like, a classic example I get a lot is like, oh man, I want a girlfriend. I want a boyfriend. I want a girlfriend. I want a boyfriend. And they just obsess, like they obsess about it, instead of just saying, all right, I've done a bit of searching. That's a little bit out of my control right now. What else could I be doing with myself that is within my control? That's actually the solution. The solution to all of this stuff is bucketing the things that are not in your control, and then start focusing on the things that are in your control. And that does require patience, because you're realizing, I can't have a girlfriend right now, I can't have a boyfriend right now, or whatever it is that you want, and you're developing the patience that you're not ready for that, or you're not meant to have that right now for whatever reason. The universe is just giving you that brick wall, and now you're starting to cultivate the tools that are currently in your possession to make value and to make meaning.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. And on it again, just thanks for like encouraging me and kind of like teaching me through that idea, because it's just really helpful for me where I'm at in my life right now. And it does not come easily for me. I did think of the Serenity prayer as you were talking. I don't know if that's what it's called, And so I'm probably going to butcher this. You may have to Google it, but there's a prayer. I think it's called the Serenity prayer, where it's like you're praying to God or the universe or a higher power for courage to change the things that you can change. And then like a sense of freedom. I can't remember the word they use, to kind of like let the things go that you can't change. And then the third thing is wisdom to know the difference. And I think that's the line that kind of captures my attention the most, is that wisdom piece. How do you know the difference? And I think that my experience in learning when patience is a virtue and when to be a go-getter, it all comes down to the battle for patience or for wisdom. And it's like, again, I'm a Bible guy, right? So like from a Bible standpoint, like folly, like the book of Proverbs, like wisdom and folly are personified as two women actually, who are trying to, wisdom calls to this young man, and folly seduces the young man, right? And he's like, which path is he going to go down, right? And I think folly, like weeds in a garden, just spring up in our hearts and in our minds so naturally. And so we don't really naturally know the difference, between things that we can change and things that we can't. So wisdom is like it's the great pursuit. It is in some ways, it's kind of the chief virtue, because if you don't have, it's like the pitcher on a baseball diamond. If the ball's not pitched, there's no play, right? Wisdom has to sort of set things in motion so that there's even a decision to make about what we can change and what we can't. So that's what interests me. I think the cultivation of wisdom, and I think that's connected to obviously patience, right? But I think it's also connected to some other themes that are important to me, like, emotional health and just being as healthy as we can and being as wise as we can.
Very, very well said. I love it, and this is where I think that any kind of philosophical slash religious wisdom is so incredibly important. I hate that we have this tendency in modern era to, religion and all this stuff makes you weak. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It has all of these really valuable nuggets, and to kind of add on to what you're saying. I've from time to time suffered from a lot of anxiety in my life. And when I say anxiety, I mean waking up at usually around 3 o'clock in the morning is when most anxiety sufferers wake up, and just staring at the ceiling for 2 hours, just worrying about things. And I'm going to give you a way, like a very concrete example of how to kind of manage anxiety. If you've ever filled out a form or a piece of paperwork, like let's say you get an email saying you need to fill out this form, and this happens to all of us, right? It could be anything. It could be, filing for a passport. It could be, anything, a mortgage, whatever, right? One of the mistakes I used to make is that I would fill out the form and then send it off, and then I would start worrying about it. I'd be like, oh, did I make a mistake? Did I put the right number here? What if my handwriting was a little sloppy? Oh no, this and that. And I filled out the form, but then it came with all the baggage of like a million things that could have gone wrong with that form. But then I just said to myself, once you physically take that form and put it in the mailbox, or once you click submit, it's over. It's done with. And if there is a mistake, let's imagine the worst case scenario. Well, worst case scenario, I get a little email saying, hey, would you mind filling that out again? Okay, no problem. That's the worst case scenario, is that you will just be told to probably do something again. It's really rare that we're going before the Supreme Court and everything has to be perfect, right? Like there are moments like that in our life, but for most of us, we're not going before the Supreme Court where every little T has to be dotted. And that's a great way of combating anxiety, is like, I did everything that I was supposed to do to the best of my ability, and now I'm going to go to bed, and I'm not really going to think about it all too much. And I think that our anxiety tricks us into doing things and worrying about things that are beyond our control. And all we're doing is eating at ourselves. Like nothing good is coming from this at all. Like like I was speaking to someone a therapist a few podcast episodes ago, and she was like, you know, worry does not help anybody. Like your worry, it does not translate into anything that is beneficial. And I'm like, yes, like just worrying about it does not help. If there's something more that you can do, then do that thing. But the worrying actually is of no value whatsoever.
At the risk of alienating people by quoting the Bible, I'm going to quote the Bible.
Heck yeah. Heck yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think that there's humor in the teachings of Jesus. Actually, I think there's humor sprinkled throughout the scripture because, I think that the writers of the Bible were trying to engage people. And part of the way that they did that was through humor. And I think there's a section in the Gospels where Jesus talks about, why do you worry? And there's some great passages I would recommend, Matthew chapter 6, which is a really beautiful passage about how God cares for the grass and the flowers and the kind of nature, like the birds. And if he's going to care for all these things that are kind of small and kind of unimportant in a way, right? Is how much more will he care for you? But there's one part where it's like, and who of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life, or
yeah, I love that. Beautiful.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Or like by being anxious, you can't add a cubit to your height. You can't turn one hair from black to gray or black to white. I mean, he says these things, and it's just some kind of amazing. And there's another line in the Psalms, Psalm 127, which is a beautiful, short kind of meditation on God, on sort of the care of God, upon us. And it says like, you eat the bread of anxious toil. I love that line. It's poetic. It's like you stay up late, you wake up early, and you eat the bread of anxious toil. And what good does all that do to you? And it talks about how, like, if God's not sort of, in all that, and like, sort of like guarding the city and watching over this process, like it's all, going to end. It's not worth, you're just worrying, right? And I to add to your point about the 3 a.m. stuff, like things are so intense in the middle of the night, and you wake up and it's like something that's so small, a pebble, kind of a metaphorical pebble in your shoe, becomes this just overwhelming boulder of anxiety, and it's not fair. and I like your worst case scenario thing. I've also heard people talk about the 7-second rule, which is like, you go to a party or something. I mean, not right now because it's COVID, right? But normally you go to a party and you meet people and you're like, and you go and you have fun and you meet people and you drink and you stay up late and then you go home, right? But in a taxi or by MTA, and you wake up the next morning and you have not necessarily a hangover, but kind of an emotional hangover, and you're like, gosh, I can't believe I said that and I did that and blah blah blah, and you have all these like little regrets, right? And the 7-second rule is you only worry about it for 7 seconds. You let yourself worry about it for 7 seconds, and then you stop worrying about it. And it's hard to turn that switch on and off, but I think it's kind of funny and honestly kind of helpful, because some of those things can really get to you.
Yes, and I think another great piece of advice that I read somewhere was like, nothing really good comes at night. Just go to bed. And I have to thank my mom quite a bit. My mom was a big bedtime person, and I used to want to stay up late and watch like South Park and wrestling and all this other stuff. And it's like, we got into these huge art. She was like a hard, like 8:30 is when you're going to bed. And now I kind of try and put myself to bed as early as humanly possible, because I noticed that the quality of my thinking really starts to go downhill past 10 o'clock. I'm going to be on, like, I notice the things, like I notice during the day, I'm reading, books. I'm like actually, making podcasts. I'm engaged in much more substantive conversation, much more. And then, at 11:30 when I'm laying in my bed with the phone, like that's the worst thing, is having the phone in the bed with you. You really start Googling like conspiracy things, and just your quality and caliber of thinking really goes down a stupid rabbit hole of nonsense. I have friends that work at night. I get it, but if you can, just go to bed at night, and like that is the best thing that you can do, is just realize that, like, I think that all of this, I think actually the artificial light is actually a producer of anxiety, because I think in previous times, when it became night, you couldn't read anymore. It was just like, all right, it's time to just go to bed. That's the end of the day. Like the end of the day is over. But once we came up with artificial light, now we just opened the door to like staying up all night and worrying about stuff and reading conspiracy theories.
I definitely encourage people to be cautious with their phones, especially around bedtime. There was like again, I'm going to butcher this because my brain is just like full of useless information. But I think that there's
not on Truth Island. On Truth Island, we'll make use of it.
Dude, yes. So
nothing gets wasted here, man.
Dude, I love that. It's so encouraging. Yeah, there was like one of those little comic boxes in the New Yorker magazine. When you're flipping through the New Yorker, there's all those little like comic strip things, cartoons, right? And one of them was like this guy lying in bed, and he's like, yes, I have 2 more hours to like look at my phone and kind of like ruin tomorrow, like, like I have time to get on YouTube and look at videos I don't really care about, and just wake up, and then therefore wake up, really tired in the morning and less than adequate for work. So yeah, I definitely support your mom in this whole virtues of bedtime, and it's just beautiful to like have like a kind of a routine, like a ritual, if you will, at the end of the day, where it's like, I had a girlfriend once who, she took a shower at the end of every day. She's like, I'm just going to wash today off, And so she's like, she took her shower and then she goes to bed. And like, there's a beauty, like sometimes days are like really, really hard, and like they're like a battleground, and it could be like just an internal battleground where you just feel like really tired because you've just been like, fighting yourself all day, or doubting yourself, or I don't know. There could be any number of reasons, almost infinite reasons that a day is hard, right? And it's just like, again, sorry about all my God language, but it's like, it's God's gift. The bedtime is like God's gift. It's like, hey, you can actually like shut the hatch, like drop the grenade inside the army tank, shut the hatch, and like the day's over. Like that day's done. Like we can move on.
I think that's very true, that we're meant to shut down. We're not robots. We're meant to shut down and call it a day. And I love that phrase, call it a day. So I think some great techniques, and one technique I should actually get more into this, but I've heard wonderful success stories, is journaling. And I've heard that keeping it, and let's make it a daytime journal, right? Maybe you should not be journaling at night when your anxiety is ultra high. I think journaling is a way of figuring out what exactly it is that you want to get out of life, because it's an inner monologue that's happening with yourself. And it takes patience, right? And you're not, on the first journal entry, you're not going to be able to figure it out. And what's interesting is that you actually, if you look, a lot of like great historic figures, like our founding fathers or whoever, a lot of them kept journals, right? And it's not this like super girly thing. Like it's like, there's actually a lot of really powerful figures in our history that actually kept journals, and you'll see that they're filled with doubt and dread and anxiety, like all the normal gambit of emotions that we feel. But I think that this process of journaling allows you to figure out what it is that I really want. And I think that taking abstract ideas and feelings and writing them down forces them into the realm of the concrete. And I think a lot of our impatience comes from the fact that we don't really know what it is that we want, right? So that kind of causes us to be highly impulsive because we're constantly traveling different places, running around, because we never actually took the time to journal and figure out what the hell do I value, what exactly it is that I want. And this like podcast, I like that it's kind of like a form of journaling. Like I'm able to actually figure out what exactly it is that I value and what are things that I want to get out of this life. And I think that's an incredibly helpful thing to do. And it takes patience. It takes patience to do that. But I realize that I have a lot more answers sitting in my apartment talking with people or talking amongst myself than I ever did just running to like Whole Foods and buying shit that I don't need.
You actually mentioned that to me last week or the week before, that like your social life has actually picked up in like this year because of Zoom and the connectivity of the internet, I guess. I think that's great. And honestly, this podcast has been great for me too. It came at a really good time, basically this year for me, because it's given me the opportunity to talk to you. I've really enjoyed our conversations, and it's been a form of kind of process for me and even kind of therapy for me, to do this kind of weekly. And I've also found a lot of comfort in journaling this year. I've kept a journal really, probably the most faithfully I've ever kept a journal in my life this year. And it's interesting. I kind of started in February, so I had a few entries in January, but like I have not missed a day since like early to mid-February. Yeah. So it'll be a year in February that I've kept a journal something every day. Right. And sometimes it is short, right? Sometimes it is at the end of the day, but you're right. Like it's nice to actually journal throughout the day and add things and make it personal. I mean, mine's a combination of things. It's a focus on, it's kind of repertorial in the sense of like, okay, what's going on, reporting what's happening today. It includes some prayers. It's a way of processing, like, hey, I have this decision to make, or this, this person in my life that's difficult, and just kind of using that paper, the pen and paper, to kind of like process and kind of think through some more, difficult situations. I forgive me if this is too much of a backtrack, but it kind of ties into our conversation today. And I kind of wanted to ask you about it because you mentioned it earlier. Speaking of like prayer, like a lot of people have prayed for this year to end, and we're about all the way about through it. We're two weeks.
Yeah, our prayers are going to be answered in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Whether you prayed that or not, it's coming.
Yeah.
And so like I've heard people say that too. And actually, this has actually been a really fruitful year. Kind of reflecting on a lot of this stuff, the podcast, the journaling, and some of the adventures and the journey that I've been on this year. It's actually been and it sounds like it's been really fruitful for you in some ways too. I'm not saying it's been easy, but like there's been a fruitfulness there. And so I guess I just want to hear your thoughts, like maybe a couple things, like why shouldn't people be praying for this year to end? I think that's my main question.
Okay. We're getting into some good stuff right now. Okay. This is going to be very grim. And hear me out on this one, but there's never really a guarantee of tomorrow. and that's something that we kind of have to be really aware of, is like never ever pray for a future that may not be. That's a huge mistake right off the bat. I'll tell you, man, when I was a kid, I had one number in the back of my head when I was going through rough times: 18. When I turn 18, I'm going to do this. When I turn 18, I'm going to do that. I'm going to have a blah, blah, blah. I'm going to have a driver's license. 18, right? And basically what I was doing is I was praying for a future that never actually came to be. Because when I was 18, I actually thought a lot differently about the world, and I was a lot more mature, and 18 was a lot more different than I thought it would be when I was 14. So right off the bat, people think 2021 vaccine, happiness, bar, all like, you don't know what exactly is going to be waiting for you at the end of that tunnel. And time is our most precious commodity. It really, as I get older, it's not money, it's really time. Time is the most precious thing, and it's the most finite resource that we really have is time, because we all die eventually. And we keep thinking that when I finish this degree, when I turn 18, when 2020 ends, I'm going to be happy. And it's like, no, 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 no. That's not how life works. You don't get happy. Like, just waiting for time to elapse is not going to bring you happiness. You will not just be magically transported into a happier, more euphoric state of being just because it's 2021. That is a huge mistake. The way that I like what Jordan Peterson says, in that happiness is a byproduct of doing something else. So the only way that you can actually get happy is doing stuff in the present, podcasting, journaling, volunteering, tutoring, helping somebody out, reading, so exercising. So doing things in the present is actually what's making that future possible. I love religion and all, but I think one misinterpretation is that, like, I like that in many respects, Judaism is a religion of action, in the sense that, like, you don't just, you pray to God in Judaism. You pray to Hashem and you say, please, Hashem. But then the very next second, you're actually taking action to make sure that that thing is coming true. And that's kind of the understanding that I have, is that you can pray, you can ask, you can have that moment, but then in the very next second, you're taking the action to make that reality come to fruition. And I think that that's a much healthier way of looking at the world, where it's like, okay, I want that better tomorrow, but that better tomorrow is only going to come about by the actions of today.
I mean, what you're talking about is really profound. And I feel like even in that was beautiful, by the way. Thank you for that. I feel like even in that, your statements there, like, we're just scratching the surface of a pretty deep philosophical question and reflection. It's Advent season in the Christian calendar right now, which is like the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. And Advent is just a Latin derivative for, the coming, so, like, Christmas celebrates the coming of Christ, Jesus. And in this season, it's like people are reminded to sort of wait. It's kind of the equivalent. It's like the Christmas equivalent of Lent. So, we don't have like Catholics, they don't have the same, like, don't eat fish kind of thing or fish on Fridays or whatever thing. There's not the same rules, but there's an emphasis on waiting and watching and patience, I think, because, like, from the Christian calendar perspective, there were like hundreds of years between the end of what we call the Old Testament, so the last sort of prophetic utterance of that era, and that was like Ezra and Nehemiah coming back to Jerusalem from their captivity and their exile, and rebuilding the walls and the temple of Jerusalem, and the prophets who spoke at that time. I think one of them was Zechariah. And so those were like kind of the last. And then I think Malachi, I guess technically Malachi would be the last prophetic. And then there were hundreds of years, what people call like the prophetic silence, of sort of the intertestamental period. And there's books from that period that are, they're by most Christians wouldn't be considered like Bible, in the same sense of like the Old and New Testament. But for the most part, sort of, it seemed like God was silent, and from the Christian perspective. And then all of a sudden, 400 years later, there's this announcement to, the Virgin Mary that she's going to have a child, and the child is going to be Jesus, and he's going to be the Messiah, Christ. And so there's a lot of waiting, and then Christ is born, and then he's silent for 30 years, in which he's a carpenter, and so we have stories from the birth of Jesus, and then it skips 30 years into his ministry, and then he starts his ministry with baptism. He gets baptized by John the Baptist, and then he goes into the wilderness, for 40 days, and then so it's just like I think, and this is true for Judaism. I mean, Abraham had to wait a long time to have his child and for God's promise to be fulfilled. There's so much waiting and watching. And I think this season, it's called Advent, is a great reminder of that spiritual theme of, waiting. And I love what you said. Like, we don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. We don't know this future that we sort of imagine. I love what you said about when you were a kid and wanting to be 18. And then when you got to be 18, like, your priorities were different and your interests were different. And, so we can take all of the themes of today, like, the themes of anxiety and not worrying and letting things go and cultivating patience as a virtue, but also knowing when to, seize the day. And I think my takeaway is, like, we don't have to be afraid of the long game. And it's so hard to hear that, because everything and every millennial bone of my body is like, no, I have to seize the good life now. And so I'm at the front of this line. If this is a line of, like, wanting to learn how to live a different kind of life and embrace a different kind of perspective, if God can take his time in that way, with sort of redemptive history, then we can take our time too.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing the Christian perspective. I think that's also interesting, and I wanna say that, like, even if we look at, let's say, those interim years of the Bible or so forth, I think that the universe has a wonderful way of not letting us move forward when it doesn't want us to move forward, right? Like, we don't even have to worry about it. Like if you send out 500 resumes or you do whatever, and the universe is just like, it ain't happening, then that's okay. I think that's a part of, like, the waiting period of, like, all right, the next chapter isn't ready to begin yet. I do think that there might be some agency. Like, let's say you've run across a brick wall that the universe has created for you. I think that there is a bit of agency that you can take at that brick wall and say, all right, clearly I can't move forward. The next saga, the next chapter has not opened up. How can I make this present moment, this brick wall, the best darn brick wall even possible? And, like, I'll even give you an example of a real brick wall. In 1989, there was something called the Berlin Wall, and it didn't come down for a long time, but people put graffiti on there and they decorated it and they put, like, inspirational messages and all this other stuff. And that's an example of, like, let's have some festivity and let's have something wonderful being created while we're waiting. And that's what I think is we can kind of mix into this. So even if we're waiting, in both Judaism and Christianity, you have this idea of a Messiah coming back, right? In Christianity, it's the second coming. In Judaism, it's a different Messiah, right? And fine, fair enough. Those are the rules of the game. But what we do in that waiting period is totally up to us. And there's a lot more agency and there's a lot more freedom that we have than we're led to believe. I think one of the things that I'm not really liking, and I have to blame Sam Harris for this, is this idea that we don't have free will, right? He's a huge proponent of, like, we have no free will. And I'm like, you could not be more wrong about that. Yes, there are brick walls. Yes, there are, COVID is a total brick wall. There are brick walls surrounding us on every corner. But what you do within those brick walls is amazing. The things that you can accomplish in a small area. Like, there have been people, Sam, that have been in small prison cells and they've come up with elaborate workout routines, bodies of Olympic build, they have like bodies that would win awards, and they were able to work out in a small cell and just create a workout. Like, the things that you can do in a confined area, there's no shortage of things. And if you have Wi-Fi, if you have a library card, no matter how much life is a waiting game, you always have that opportunity to seize that present moment.
Beautiful, man. I love the example of the Berlin Wall. You know how they created beauty, they cultivated beauty while they were waiting, for this wall to fall. I've noticed that in Colombia, literally every surface is covered with graffiti and paint and color, and it's vivid and vibrant and beautiful. It's the same in Haiti. I was in Haiti in 2017, and there's color everywhere. I think we sort of think that these places are like mired in civil war and economic unrest and stuff like that, and sometimes that's true, but like, and that for some reason that they're drab or like, really depressed places, and maybe that's true sometimes too, but like my experience of these countries in the Caribbean and Latin America is that they're just like they're colorful, they're really colorful and beautiful, and people have taken the time to cultivate beauty, and I think for me, I've had to overcome some fatalism. You've talked about tomorrow on this podcast, and it's like we don't know what tomorrow will bring, and so, but sometimes I thought I did. Sometimes I thought I did know what the future was. I have a strong sense of destiny. I tried to, date this girl in 2012, I think it was. I was 24, and we'd gone to college together, and I ignored, kind of yellow flags and red flags about the relationship, and even her kind of telling me like, I'm not really interested. Like, you're a nice guy, but I'm not interested. Because I thought I sort of knew the future. I sort of had this sense of destiny. Like God had sort of like shown me this special insight where I was supposed to be with this girl. And I prayed to God for guidance. It was like, at the end of the day, like I heard God's voice wrong, or I was just completely deluded. I think I was just deluded. I think I was just mistaken about how life works. We have agency. We have more agency than we think, always, I think. And so I've struggled as a Christian, and in Christian theology, there's a strong emphasis on what's called the providence of God, and it's like that there's a plan. Everything happens for a reason, and God's sovereign over the affairs of the world and over the affairs of your life. And I still believe that there's a plan, and God is, in control. But I think as I've gotten older, my belief in the doctrine of human agency has only increased. And so I'll just say one more thing, which is that, I feel like you almost preached to me, and I mean that as a compliment. It was kind of like a sermon, my COVID sermon from Pastor Aaron. You were kind of like, you've got to bloom where you're planted. You got to find the meaning in this time frame, right? And so you were like, there's probably some, grandma, that you can, some old lady that, at your hostel or in your environment that you can talk to and glean from, and be a blessing to, there's, just as an example, like somebody that you kind of wouldn't expect, and there's always more opportunities and more agency than you think. And in a way, also less, just because of our finiteness, where we're limited. And I don't know how to express that, because it sounds like I'm saying two things, but I'm not really. I guess I'm just saying we have more and less than we think at the same time, I guess.
Yes, Sam. I think our final takeaway is going to be this. If you ever find yourself sitting at a red light, take a moment and really enjoy the music coming from the radio. Maybe take a little look out your window, enjoy the scenery, take a deep breath, and just relax and just really savor what's going on in that moment, knowing you cannot press the gas right now. And then as soon as it turns green, go ahead and keep on driving, but don't worry about it. Sam, thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This concludes the 95th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.